You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on Numbers. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders, and I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner. He's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
Yes, today it's an unusual one. It's almost like a phrase.
Okay.
It's called an uplifted hand. And it's when a person does anything almost defiantly against God. And the Hebrew is with a hand lifted up.
Okay.
And I almost think it's like a person shaking their fist at God's face.
Towards God.
Yeah.
Because we've spoken in previous episodes about a different kind of uplifted hand.
Yeah,
right?
and that's when God lifted up his hand.
Yeah,
to
in
get
Isaiah,
ready,
right? Yeah.
to be ready to spank somebody, it sounds like.
Yeah.
This is
a
when
little different.
Yeah, this is when a person lifts up their hand. Here's what it says in Numbers 15:13.
Mm-hmm.
When a person does anything defiantly, and that's with the hand lifted up, whether it's a native or an alien or one that one is blaspheming the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from among his people. So that's a pretty serious charge, but it's the idea of, I think, almost saying something so belligerent to God that it actually cuts
blasphemy.
them. Yeah, and it's cutting them off.
Right.
That person is supposed to be cut off from his people. I think it's almost like something like mocking or defiantly regarding something against God.
Yeah.
So it's almost
for that kind of
blatantly
response to kind of make sense.
Yeah.
And so it's a phrase. It's two words, really.
Yeah.
And is it kind of like, what's the construction kind of? It's like hand that is lifted or something?
Yeah. So it's the first one is probably a noun with a hand. And then the next one looks like it's a participle being lifted up.
Lifted. Yeah. Okay.
So
Can you tell us how to pronounce it?
Yeah. With the ba, it's bayad is the first part. Rama.
Rama.
Yeah.
And that would be the lifted up part.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And then the other one that's kind of interesting says it is blasphemy. So it makes it pretty strong.
Yeah.
So
that is.
So that's our word for the day.
And that introduces,
do not do it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That also tells us what book we're looking at today.
Yeah, that's right. It's in Numbers.
Numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's look at it and see what
let's
we've
check
got.
it out. Yeah.
I've got a phrase or a verse here that kind of summarizes it. It says, "So the Lord said, I have pardoned them according to your word. But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers." So that means that, remember, all those people that were alive at that time are in those wilderness wanderings going to die off because they're not going to be able to go into the land.
Yeah, right.
So that's why I kind of got this as kind of like a summary, because Numbers is the one where they're all wandering around. And so I thought that's a really good couple of verses to pull it together.
Yeah.
All right. Here's my outline.
Okay.
I've got... I dated around the 1400s, at least the context is suggesting that. The author traditionally is Moses, Numbers 33:12, pretty much, or 33:2 pretty much says that. Purpose is to tell the history from Sinai to the Promised Land. So that's our time period here of basically that 40 years of wilderness wanderings.
Yeah.
And I've got the key verse, and we pretty much looked at those. So it's got a section that's their time, and it's about 20 days in Sinai. And that goes to about chapter 10, verse 10.
Yeah.
Then it goes to about chapter 20. Verse 20 is their time from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea.
So that's a pretty long time.
Yeah. And that's 38 years.
Yeah.
It's interesting. That includes a time when they're wandering in the wilderness. They come to Kadesh, and God's tells them to go into the land. And at first they refuse. And then later, after they see that God's going to punish them, they say, okay, then we'll go in. But God says, no, you made your decision. You're not going in at all. And then after that, Kadesh, they wander around in the wilderness and then come back to Kadesh. And that's when this picks up. And then it says from Kadesh to the plains of Moab. So that's from the last part of them getting to Kadesh again and then going to Moab.
Okay.
So it's interesting. Those are the main parts of the book. And I've got in here, grumbling is kind of the key word for this book.
Yeah.
Okay. The title is In the Wilderness. The name Numbers comes from the Septuagint, probably because there's two. Yeah, yeah. It's the Hebrew is in the wilderness, so it's kind of interesting.
That is fascinating.
And it's probably because there's two censuses in the book. Sensai, I guess you'd call it.
Right, yeah.
In the book. One is in chapter 1 and one's in chapter 26. Yeah. And then the date of the Numbers covers about 39 years.
Yeah, makes sense, yeah.
So that's kind of it. I've got 20 days at Mount Sinai. So you've got Mount Sinai down here. Then the 3 months in the wilderness of Paran. You can pretty much see that in that area. Then they get to Kadesh Barnea. And that's then from chapters 20, from 10 to about chapter 20. They're wandering. And then they get back to Moab, or back to Kadesh, and then go to Moab. And that's the last 16 chapters. So that gives you some clue about where they are wandering.
It's a pretty big area they're covering.
Yeah, and remember, there's a lot of them that are wandering in that time, in that area. So it's kind of, it makes you wonder how they could do that and not cover the same area multiple times and say, I know where I am. I've been here before.
Yeah.
Of course, maybe they did see that. We just doesn't tell us.
Right.
Now, the dates in the book are kind of interesting. So what I tried to do is I pulled out all the dates to help give you some understanding of it. And it starts in Exodus 19:1, in the third month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt. On that very day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. Okay. So the first year they come out, it takes them 3 months to get from Egypt to Sinai, or Mount Sinai. Okay. Then Numbers 1:1, it says that the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting in the first of the second month of the second year.
First day of the second month?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Is that that's what that would mean, though? Kind
of
the second month. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And then Numbers 9 says, thus the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness in Sinai in the first month of the second year. So what you've got there is you've got out of chronological order. Yeah. So it helps you to know.
Sure.
I read an article once that talked about, it's called dyschronological chronology, where something would be put out of time so that it could be explained better, and then it comes back in and it repeats where they were before and then takes off again. That's almost like what was happening here. There was probably some events that they needed recorded in Scripture. Yeah. And so while they're doing that, it's outside of the time period, so they put it in there, then come back to that, because up here on the second year in the second month in the 20th of the month. So it comes back to where they were before.
Where you expect.
Yeah. And then goes on. Okay, so then Numbers 13 says they started spying out the land at the end of 40 days. So we got that. Yep. Numbers 14, your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness. So that gives you the logic of how long they're going to be there. Then Numbers 21 says the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came from the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. So again, that's going back in time again from the first month. Because remember, we'd already got up to the second month. So this again, going back.
A little excursion kind of.
Yeah. And then chapter 20, verse 22 says, and they set out from Kadesh, the sons of Israel, the whole congregation came to Mount Hur. Okay? So now we've got... it must have taken about 6 months to get from Kadesh to the plains of Moab. Here's how I figured that out. It says in Numbers 33:26 that Aaron the priest was up to Mount Hor at the command of the Lord. So that's where he's going to die. Mount Hor is not too far from the Kadesh Barnea. It's somewhere in that area. Yeah. And then it says they mourned for him for 30 days. So if you put the fifth month and the 30 days,
it's 6.
So it's at least 60 or 6 months before he goes on. Okay. And then Deuteronomy says, now the time it took them to come from Kadesh Barnea until we crossed over the brook of Zered, which is Zered is as they're going into Moab again. Okay. Was 38 years. Okay. So it's kind of interesting. It's giving you the logic and some of the dates that help you get moved along. And some of them look like they go back rather than chronological.
Right.
So I thought that'd be helpful to see that at least so they know what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is helpful.
Okay. All right. Now we get into the sojourn at Sinai. It says it's about 20 days because it's the second month, second year. It says on the 21st day they head out. Yeah. So they're there that long. they take a census to let us know what is going on there, and they come up with 603,550 people plus, these are the men, plus Levites.
Okay.
So if there's that many fighting men, then they each have probably children, they each have a wife,
Yeah.
or at least not all of them, but most of them have wives.
Yeah.
So you can see this number is pretty large.
Yeah.
Okay. That's why people have said, well, it's probably over 1 million that they're being led in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And I can see why easily probably over 1 million.
Yeah. That's a stunning amount of people.
It sure seems like it, yeah. All right, it's kind of interesting in chapter 2, they've got 2 major, and 3, they've got 2 major things that happen. First of all, they put, they're each centered kind of around the tent of meeting.
Mm-hmm.
The tent of meeting is where God's tabernacle and stuff like
Yeah.
that is going to be. And they arrange the tribes around them
Mm-hmm.
so that all of them have, access to
Yeah, sure.
the ark kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then it says from 20 years old and upwards, and they're going to count those people. At one point, it tells them that up to 50. After 50, the Levites couldn't carry the ark anymore.
Up to the age of 50?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my guess is I don't know if that 20 years and upwards means all the way, or if it stops at 52.
I see.
I
Yeah,
don't know.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, they're said not to number the Levites because they're going to have a totally separate job. But then it's really interesting in chapter 3, they go through. So it gives the number of firstborn, it gives the number of Levites, and it happens that there's more firstborn than Levites. So it's like God didn't get enough. What he's doing is he's making it real clear that these firstborn are now taking the place, or the Levites are now taking the place of the firstborn. And remember, the firstborn were God's special chosen ones.
Yeah.
So what happens is there's 283 people that God got ripped off. He didn't have as many of them because the Levites were shorter than that.
Yeah.
So basically, they have to pay 5 shekels for each one of those and put it into the temple treasuries, so that we realize that this group of people is now being taken over by this group of people. So
So it kind of makes it equal in a way.
Yeah.
It kind of balances it.
yeah, and it's so clear that he's saying this group now is this group in
Yeah.
my mind.
Wow.
So yeah, that's in my
That is
mind.
very
That's really
interesting.
something. All right, then he goes through and explains how many Levites there are and the different groups. All right, so that's kind of interesting. And then it tells that each of the different groups of Levites have different jobs.
Different roles.
Yeah, so that's kind of basically what's talked about there. And it gives the number of each of the tribes. Okay. Oh, and here's where it's talking about the 30 years to 50 years old. It seems like to me that's really 50 years old. You're still in your prime almost. So why were they not allowed to carry things for the temple at that point? And I don't know because we know people lived quite a while still. I'm assuming that the reason is that it was such an important job. God didn't want people that might trip or were not in their prime to carry the Lord's thing. It's kind of interesting there.
Yeah.
I
There's
just,
not really an explanation given. It's
Yeah.
just kind of a...
yeah, I just thought you should know that.
Yeah.
Oh, and then it talks about defilement, special ones like a leper or sexual sins. Those people were supposed to be away from the camp so that they didn't defile the camp.
Yeah.
And I assume that the reason was that they wanted God's place where he was going to dwell to be pure and holy as much as possible.
But they weren't necessarily exiled.
No,
It was kind of on
it
the
said
outside.
outside of the camp. Yeah.
So it is outside, really.
At least you will send away both male and female, who not send outside the camp, so they will not defile the camp where I dwell in their midst. So that's the verse that seems to make it clear why they're out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the next one is the most interesting passage in Numbers, I think.
Okay.
It's that adultery test. Okay, so let me go to it. And I'm going to actually read it. This is going to sound funny, but I want to read it because I want you to know what's going on. All right, so
What chapter are we in?
I'm in chapter 5. Yeah. And I'm not going to do it all, but there's some sections I want to read. Okay.
Yeah.
So verse 12 says, "So speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, if any man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him, and a man has intercourse with her and is hidden from the eyes of her husband, and she is undetected, although she has defiled herself, and there's no witness against her, and she is not been caught in the act, a man, and then I'm going to skip a little, verse 15, the man shall then bring his wife to the priest and shall bring an offering to her, for her, 1/10 of an ephah of barley meal, that he shall not pour oil on it, but nor put frankincense on it, for it is a grain offering of jealousy, a grain offering of memorial, a reminder of iniquity. Then the priest shall bring her near and stand her before the Lord, and the priest shall take holy water in an earthenware vessel, and he shall take some of the dust that's on the floor of the tabernacle and put it into the water. What is that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, then it says, and she will take an oath, and it's added to this mixture, and then she's going to drink it. So what is going on?
Yeah.
All right. In the Code of Hammurabi, Law 128, if the wife of a senior man, basically, has been caught lying with another man, and they shall bind them and throw them into the river. Okay?
Wow.
If the husband of the woman wishes to spare his wife, then the king, in turn, shall spare his subject. Man, in my mind, that one's... no matter what, I mean, I assume the reason is you throw them into the river. If they come out, then they're innocent, right? But how good a chance is that if you tie the person's hands behind their back and throw them into a river? Are they ever going to make it out?
Right.
So that one seems to me that's a guarantee that person's going to die.
Yeah.
So what is this thing that God is doing? Now, let me go back for a minute. Notice there's some things that are really important. It's a person that's committed adultery, a wife against a husband.
Yeah.
Now, why is it done that way? Remember in the Old Testament, the husband had to pay a dowry for the wife. So he's got money involved into this. And so he's basically lost his money is kind of what it's, this is going to sound not very good, but remember women in the Old Testament were more like property.
Right.
And so he's paid money for this property, and now this property is defiled.
Right.
But the problem is there's no witnesses, so nobody knows. But it says in the passage that a spirit of jealousy comes upon the person.
I see.
So
That's what I was going to ask, because it is
Yeah.
kind of specific about not being detected and not being caught.
Right. So then why would it even be brought up, right? Yeah. And the thing is the husband apparently has a spirit of jealousy come upon him, and then he is questioning his wife.
Yeah.
So what happens then is that this curse is he takes him before God in the temple. She's going to drink this thing, and it'll show whether God, it says later that if she's has committed iniquity or adultery, then her stomach is going to waste away and her insides are going to swell up. So my understanding is that giving the logic to God to who can see all things, to judge between these people. So it seems like to me, at least the biblical text is a whole lot more logical and more fair than the Babylonian one.
Right.
So now, why would God put something like this in Scripture? I think it's to protect marriage. Right now, you might have somebody that's just really jealous of his wife and all that. So he has to pay a certain amount to do that. So if this guy's bringing his wife every week to the temple saying, I got the spirit of jealousy coming upon me, I think this wife has committed adultery, he has to pay something each time he does it. So it's going to cost him. But then I also think it's not such an outrageous price. And then God is going to judge between whether it really is, if she's fair or not. So in one sense, it's going to be a protection for marriage. So what it's going to do is that when a husband gets jealous, if there's nothing that's happened and this guy's just jealous, God's going to clarify that, make it real clear. This woman is fine. She didn't do anything.
Yeah.
So I think in one sense it's a protection for marriage, and I think that's why it's there.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to know that this one is a whole lot more fair in my mind than the Babylonian one.
Right, yeah.
So does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. That's a very interesting...
Yeah. And I think you've got to think of the logic. Why would God put something like this in Scripture? And and it makes it real clear. Nobody else knows it. And so God's going to make a way that when they detect something like this, God can do it.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting.
Very fascinating.
Yeah. In Deuteronomy, it actually 22:22, it says, "If a man is found lying with a married woman, both of them shall die, the man who lays with the woman and the woman. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel." God does seem to have a higher standard
Yeah.
than what is in the Code of Hammurabi, because remember what it had there is
yeah.
that if the king, the king or the husband wants to spare the wife, then the king can spare the other guy. Well, God doesn't allow that to happen. This is a going against what his law states.
Yeah.
And so they're both
there's
going to be punished for
consequences.
that.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting one.
Yeah.
Another one that's I kind of think is interesting is that Nazirite vow. In there, they dedicate themselves to the Lord, and it seems like why would somebody do this? I assume they wanted to honor God by showing their devotion to Him about doing this vow. Because why would you do it otherwise? It's refrain from wine and strong drink, no vinegar or wine. You shall not cut your hair. Stay ritually pure. When it is over, you offer a sacrifice, and the dedicated hair that the person grew is to be offered to the temple or to God, basically.
Yeah.
I think Acts 18:18 has Paul doing something very similar. So I'm thinking he's doing a Nazirite vow. Yeah, it doesn't give us all the stuff, but it does say in Caesarea he had his hair cut for his keeping a vow. So it would suggest that could be what he's doing.
Oh, interesting.
But if that's true, then what's Paul doing? He's trying to show his dedication to God.
Yeah.
Out of his love, I assume, is the whole purpose for something like this.
So is this a temporary kind of vow?
Yes. Yeah.
It's like for a period of time.
Yep. And it would be because that's when your hair's growing up. So
there's a point where it ends.
Yeah, I assume that what Paul's doing, notice he had his hair cut in Caesarea. So my guess is then from that point on until it grows, that all that hair is offered up to God.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of neat.
That is, yeah.
And then you have to keep going back. Well, why would you do this? And I think it's to show your heart love for God, a special dedication to show Him that you care about Him.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. All right, the Aaronic blessing.
Okay.
The silver amulets were have some of the earliest biblical texts that we have from the Bible, and it's the one you guys know. I mean, it's real familiar. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you, and all that, and be gracious to you. You can see it here. This will be actually kind of fun for you, Tyler, because notice that those are not the Hebrew letters that you know.
Right.
These are Paleo-Hebrew. So this is an older Hebrew than what the people today learn as Hebrew.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's called Paleo-Hebrew, which suggests how old this text is. It's got to be before the exile, because when they came back from the exile, remember, they had probably an Aramaic script that they were using. So this is pre-exile coming back.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so, this is found on, when you say silver amulet, what exactly is that?
They're probably little rolls of silver that were thin. They seem to be probably had my guess
like
is
engraved or something.
Yeah, engraved on these silver, and then I assume that in the roll they had a chain or something through them, almost like you'd use as jewelry.
Yeah.
Remember, God tells us to keep. It tells us to write have the law in your hands and stuff like that, and on your doorposts. I assume this was another way you could do it: is put God's word in a little bracelet kind of thing, and then wear it.
Wow.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. It was found in a tomb, real close, almost right near the old city, on the basically outside the wall in the area where the graves were, next to the valley, Kidron Valley.
Wow.
Yeah. So I thought
the characters are very different looking than what you would expect in Hebrew.
Yeah.
It's very, very distinct.
And the good news about it is that tells you how old it is.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah.
All right. Basically, this one's kind of interesting. In chapter 7, they actually have all the different offerings that were brought by each of the different tribes. So this was how. Remember, what's going to happen is the temple or the tabernacle needs to be built, and they need to keep it running. So in Leviticus, at the end, it's talked about what it was all supposed to look like, and then now this is to keep the tabernacle going, so that they could have a sacrifice. We find out later there's a morning sacrifice, an evening sacrifice, and stuff. Well, that's going to take a lot of money. So basically, this stuff, these that came from each of these tribes, was what kept the tabernacle going in functioning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it had each of the heads of the household or the tribes doing that.
Okay, that's what I was about to ask you. Is that
Yeah.
what the first names are on this list?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have on this list, you have the name of the head of that household followed by the
the tribe
actual
that they're
name.
in.
Yeah, the name of the tribe.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
So I thought that's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. And then there's a dedication offering. It actually talks about it. It says, this was the dedication offering for the altar for the leaders of Israel. In the day it was anointed. So there was a special ceremony or something to get it inaugurated. And it goes through, these are the offerings and all that. And then at the end, it says, this is a dedication offering for the altar after it was anointed. So it sounds like we've got a list of what it takes, and then maybe either an inclusio to say, okay, at the end, this is what it was, or it is possible even that this is a list that then goes on and explains the things. I think it's more of an inclusio to let you know this was the offering.
This is what consisted of it. Yeah.
So I thought that's interesting. Chapter 7, verse 89 actually says, now when Moses was speaking, went into the tent of meetings to speak with God, basically, he heard a voice speaking to him from above the mercy seat that was on the ark of the testimony from between the two cherubim. So he spoke to him. So it's almost directed. The voice was almost directed from the top of the mercy seat between the two cherubs.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then in that same chapter, it says. I think this is later. It says that Moses was the prophet par excellence. This is actually in 12, I think, but it says because he spoke to God face to face. Now we know he can't see God, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that, but he could hear it coming from that specific spot.
Yeah.
So it's as if you're talking to someone face to face. You're hearing the voice just like it's us talking together.
Yeah.
So I think that's what that figure of speech means. He spoke to God face to face, means he heard it just like if he was talking to somebody.
Now, I think we've talked about this before, but maybe give me a refresher.
Sure.
So in the ark, that was kind of, the idea was this was like a throne essentially.
I think so, yeah.
Probably, right? 'Cause
Yeah.
that's what other ancient Near East
Yeah.
cultures would kind of have. There's something similar to an ark, and it was like a chair almost for their god.
And the interesting thing is, in Israel, you were not to make any images of God.
Yeah.
So in the ancient Near East, you had the gods sitting on the throne and all that.
It was actually like a statue or something of them sitting on.
And here, there's nothing like that.
Yeah, right,
You know? These
right.
cherubim basically are the ones, if they're like the seraphim at all in Isaiah, chapter 6, they're the ones that are actually, cherubim were said to guard God's glory. They were on the veil of the temple later on.
Okay, yeah.
And you weren't supposed to go into that. So
Yeah.
apparently the cherubim were to guard God's glory.
Yeah.
Well, that would fit perfectly here. These cherubim are guarding God's glory as he speaks right from there.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's
So,
pretty fascinating.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought that's helpful. All right, Numbers 8, we are going to go on. It talks about purification of the Levites. There's that mandatory retirement at age 50. So they worked from 25 to 50, and I assume that meant in their prime, when they were the strongest and all that, because they had a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
You must separate the Levites from among the sons of Israel, and the Levites shall be mine. Remember, we talked about him even paying to make sure that this equaled this from the firstborn to now the Levites are God's people. And then verse 8, 24 and 25. This is what applies to the Levites. From 25 years old and upward, they shall enter and perform service in the work of the tent of meeting. But at age 50, they shall retire from the service and the work and not work anymore. Now notice it says from 25 years old and upwards. That's the phrase that we had earlier. So that's why I wondered if that meant up until 50, because in this passage, it actually limits it at that point.
Right.
So I'm not sure, but it sounds like it's at least
possibility.
possible.
Yeah.
And then it also talked about the second Passover. And it said that there was a problem because, well, I'll read it here in chapter 9, verse 6. But there were some men who were unclean because of dead persons. Now remember, when they're wandering the wilderness, a lot of people are dying off and all that.
Yeah.
So that first time that it was time of the Passover, some people had touched dead bodies, and so they were
they had
impure.
to,
Yeah, right. Okay, so they could not observe Passover in that day, so they came before Moses and Aaron on that day. So the second one was for those who were unclean during that time.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I assume the logic of why this is in there is to let you know God wanted that idea of a Passover to remember that you're supposed to be pure when you take that, and if you're impure, you can't.
Right.
But here's some people that cared so much about taking it that they couldn't do it when it was at the right time, but really from no fault of their own. What do you do with these dead people when they die off? You got to take care of them.
So this gives basically an opportunity for like it's not really even like a redo, but it's a second chance. So you have an opportunity to kind of ritually clean yourself and prepare for a Passover. Without been waiting a year essentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought that's interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, this one I think is also funny. In Numbers 9:17, it made it real clear that the Israelites were supposed to move whenever the cloud was lifted from the tent.
Yeah.
Okay, and then whenever the cloud settled down, that's where they were supposed to spend the night. Yeah. Okay, now look at Numbers 9:19 through 21. Even when the cloud lingered over the tabernacle for many days, the sons of Israel would keep the Lord's charge and not set out. If sometimes the cloud remained a few days over the tabernacle, according to the command of the Lord, they remained camped. Then, according to the command of the Lord, they went out. If sometimes the cloud remained from evening till morning, when the cloud was lifted up in the morning, they would move out. Or if it remained in the daytime and at night, whenever the cloud was lifted up, they would set out. It almost makes it sound like these guys, God's almost testing them. Sometimes, it takes off at different times of the day, and then sometimes it even take off at night. And so I'm thinking, why is God doing that? And I think it's to remember that they are supposed to obey God. Remember, a lot of these things during the wilderness wanderings are to teach the Israelites. I'm assuming this one is to make sure.
It's another lesson.
Yeah, they realize you don't go unless I go. And then you stay when I say stay, no matter when it is. Yeah. So if it's inconvenient, you still follow my law. Yeah. So I think that's what's going on. I put down here, could God's special guidance get old? And I think sometimes it could,
Sure,
you're all ready to take off and it's still there, not moved, picked up.
Yeah.
So I thought that was funny.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. And then in that same chapter, it's got, or I think a later chapter, it's got the silver trumpets talked about. And I think that's only there to let them know that if you ever had to call all the Israelites and let them know something, there's a silver trumpet that was blown so they either knew it was danger or to gather together to find out about something. So it was interesting. Remember, if there's that many people, you need some way to get their attention.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and we're so accustomed to the ease of mass communication.
Yeah.
It's so simple to get word out to a lot of people at one time, and that's a very, very recent development. One of the this is a little excursion. Have you ever seen that movie 1917? It's a World War I movie. The conceit, it looks like it's all done in one shot. So you're following two messengers from one portion of the army to another to try to save everybody.
Yeah.
But the director, the way he kind of talked about it was like in 1917 or in World War I, you could fire a weapon that would go so far, you could hurt someone so far away from you, but you had no ability to communicate with the person in the trench 100 feet away.
Yeah.
And so coordination was extraordinarily difficult. So you imagine something like this, or 1 million people, or more than 1 million, over a desert. I mean, it would be unbelievably challenging to coordinate movement.
Now think about it. And here's God knowing that a trumpet can send a blast out so loud and so piercing that people from miles around will hear it.
Yeah.
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah. Well, and you think the cloud is an interesting element too, because that probably would be visible from quite a distance. I think, so you would kind of know. Yeah,
it seems like it would be necessary, right? So almost like a pillar, so that people could see when it takes off and when it doesn't. Yeah, that's good. All right, now we're at chapter 10. That next
this is
section,
like our second section.
Yeah,
this is the longest period of time.
Yep. Yeah. Numbers 1 says, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first of the second month in the second year after they came out of land of Egypt. Now, the next one says, now they took off from Mount Sinai on the second year on the second month, the 20th day of the month. So now you've got it 20 days after that one was given. So I thought, oh, okay. So it sounds like they stayed on there for a year because that was the first time. This is a second year and second month, so like a year and 2 months, and 21 or 20 days. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it helps give some structure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now in the second year, the second month, on the 20th of the month, the cloud was lifted over the tabernacle. And that's chapter 10, verse 11. So now you know it's time to move on.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gives the marching arrangement again. So it gave the order of them. Oh, there's another interesting thing in Numbers, and I pulled these out from the various passages. The question is what is Moses' father-in-law's name? Because it sounds like in chapter 10, verse 29, it says, and Moses said to Hobab, the son of Ruel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then you go to in Exodus. Now, this goes back, Exodus 3:1 and 18:12. Now, Moses was pasturing the flocks of Jethro, his father-in-law.
Yeah.
Then in Exodus 2:18, why they came to Ruel, their father, and said, why have you come back so early today?
Yeah.
So what's this guy's name?
Yeah.
I actually think that probably the Ruel down here is probably, because it says their father, but the word father could be grandfather or great-grandfather or something like that.
Patriarch.
Yeah, notice that this is Hobab, the son of Ruel. So my guess is Ruel's the father. They come back, or the grandfather. They come back and say, "Why have you come?" He said, "Why you come back so early?" But it's Hobab or Jethro that's the real name of Moses' father-in-law. My guess is that probably he had two names. Is that both of these actually are the names of his
legitimate
father-in-law?
names of it. Yeah.
Yeah, we do know that David actually had two names. Several people get their name changed, Abraham and Israel. So I'm wondering if that's what happened here. We have two various names for the same guy.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's quite a funny thing to have all that.
That'd be kind of confusing. Yeah.
All right, grumbling in the camp. Remember on my summary, chapter 11, they complain about the manna, and God says fire among them. Then because they want meat, then they're gonna. God gives them meat, and even while it's in their mouth, He sends a plague among them.
Yeah.
So the punishments kept coming. At that same chapter, it talks about Moses can't take anymore, and he's just fed up with them. And Jethro is one of them that comes to him and says, "Well, you're trying to take on too much. I mean, this is a whole nation, and you're guiding everybody." So he says, get 70 elders that can actually help you. That, in my mind, that was a brilliant move. But Numbers 11:25 is real interesting. It says, then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him. And he took of the Spirit who was upon him, I assume that's Moses, and placed him upon the 70 elders. That when the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, but they did not do it again. My understanding is that idea of prophesying was, remember Saul is laying on the ground prophesying, and they say, "Oh, is he among the prophets also?" My guess is that idea of prophesying was for identification, that they were connected to God.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably what's happening here. This is happening upon them so that they can actually see
It shows some kind of level of
connection,
authority, kind of
with God, so that if those people came to them, these elders,
they
and were
could know.
and trying to figure out, man, should I listen to this person or not?
Yeah.
You better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and I think your earlier points of here about the grumbling about the manna, that kind of goes back to that idea of the follow the cloud. You know.
Oh yeah.
At weird times, because like people, it is easy to forget.
Yeah.
The miracle of that, I think.
Oh yeah.
You know, you need a lot of reminders. You'd think wandering around the wilderness would do it, but obviously we're very similar. Ourselves.
Yeah. It also talks about Eldad and Medad prophesying, and Moses says, "Let them." If they're prophesying, that's probably from God. So let them. And then we got the quail coming down and God punishing because of their greed.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we look at that and say, "Oh man, these Israelites, they can't seem to obey God at all." Yeah. But remember, they're under severe. I mean, think about it. They're in the desert.
Yeah.
The first one was they didn't have any water. Well, how long would you and I last if we didn't have water? Of course we're going to grumble.
Yeah.
But all these, it seem like we're tested. And remember that one passage that says, "You tested me these 10 times."
Yeah.
So I assume that the ones that are recorded in Scripture are only a portion of the ones that actually happened. So, But remember, it's a long period of time too. I grumble and complain a lot, but this is, at least over 3 months was the one period to Sinai.
Right.
And then from then on, this is in the next section.
Yeah.
So I can't hardly knock them.
Yeah, right.
And then in chapter 12, we've got Miriam and Aaron, who they complain and say, well, God speaks through us just as much as you. And that's when God speaks up and tells him that he's a prophet. He's like no other prophet. This one, God speaks to him face to face. Yeah. Or it's mouth to mouth is literally. And at that point, Miriam becomes leprous for 7 days. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And now we all go, why did he do it to Miriam when Aaron was there too? He could have got it. But remember, Aaron's a high priest. If he would have done it to him, that meant he would not be able to be high priest anymore.
Right.
If it happens to Miriam, and it's a temporary thing, because he says, well, if you spit on your father, wouldn't you have to have 7 days of uncleanness? So my guess is that when this is happening, he's giving a lesson, but he's not doing something that would damage him forever.
Yeah.
Even Miriam, okay, she'll be leprous and scared to death for 7 days.
Yeah.
But then it'll be over and no harm, no foul kind of thing.
Yeah.
So my guess is that that's probably what is going on and why he didn't do it to Aaron.
Yeah.
Because if he did it to him, his job would be done.
Now, when it says as white as snow as well, is that kind of a reference to like close to death? Like, is that what they were worried about? Is she pale? Like,
I think that leprosy was something that actually had
that was part of leprosy.
Part of it, I think.
Paleness. Okay.
Yeah, and more than paleness, almost like a crusty white thing on it, even.
Oh, I see.
So I
see.
assume that was what it was.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's my guess. 12 spies, remember, now they get to Kadesh, down here at the very bottom of our map here.
Yeah.
And they're going to now go all the way. They actually go all the way. Now there's 12 spies. They're all going to go, one from each tribe, going to go all the way through the land. They get all the way up to Lobo Hamath is where it is. Now that means they have gone through basically every place that they would have seen what the land was.
Yeah.
So they did a good job of spying out the land, and they come back and say it's really good, but we can't take it. These people, one thing that was interesting, it says they come to the valley of Eshcol and they cut a branch of a single cluster of grapes and they carry the pole between two men, some of the pomegranates and the figs. See, this has become the tourist symbol of Israel, the two men carrying indicating how great how productive the land is. Yeah. So it's interesting that that's the image that has become Israel's tourism label.
Wow.
So, but I thought it was interesting. Down here by Hebron is probably where that Valley of Eshcol is. But that does let you know just how productive that land was.
More than one person could carry.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. In chapter 14, they rebel again. The people were too afraid to go into the land, and so they rebel. So God gets ready to wipe them out, but Moses prays and they're spared. Though remember, they says they will not see the land. That's the very clear verse that I think helps us.
Yeah.
So here it is. So the Lord said, I have pardoned them according to your word, but as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Surely the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness. So he's saying, you guys have had an awful lot of examples of my glory, and you still rebelled. And have put me to test these 10 times. I assume 10 there is just a large
generic term.
A large number.
Yeah.
And have not listened to my voice, but shall by no means see the Lord, by no means see the land which I have sworn to their fathers. So that's and then they want to go in. Is that just like us? So and that's when God has to punish them.
Yeah.
Oh, then 15 through 17. Laws for the promised land. He says sacrifices are still going to be important in the new land. The law of the sojourner, he may sacrifice also. So he's actually now saying that there's other people that may incorporate themselves into your nation, and that's okay. Sabbath breaking would be punishing. And then they give us an example of those two people gathering, or the guy gathering the wood and he gets killed.
Yeah.
And then Korah's rebellion. Korah is a Levi that wants to also lead the people, and God punishes him. And the way he does that, and there's actually several, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Anyway, that's where the ground opens up and swallows them. Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
That'll do it.
Yeah, and Aaron's budding ram in chapter 17. That was, or budding rod,
The rod,
his buds. Remember, the Korahites were saying, we're just as authorized as you to lead these people. And God makes it real clear, no, it's Aaron that's supposed to do it. And he does that. It says, it will come about that the rod of the man whom I choose will sprout. Thus I will lessen from myself the grumblings of the sons of Israel, who are grumbling against you. Moses therefore spoke to the sons of Israel, and all the leaders gave them a rod apiece. On the next day, Moses went into the tent of testimony, and behold, the rod of Aaron, the house of Israel, had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms and bore ripe almonds.
Wow.
Yeah, I
fruited
think,
too.
yeah, that's what I think is funny. He had said the rod that sprouts, that will be the one that chooses. He didn't just sprout; it actually burst forth fruit, the blossoms, and even bore fruit. So I thought that's really, God's making it really clear to them.
Right.
Yeah, when you think about a rod is something you cut off, and I assume that like a staff or something.
Right.
And he's got it now sprouting out and growing.
It would have been way dead.
Yeah. So that would have been a clear message to them, I would have thought. Chapter 18 talks about the priest's job after the mishap with Korah's rebellion. Now they had to make sure they did it right. Ritual purification. They've got this red heifer sacrifice. It's hard to know the purpose of the statute, but it's clearly for purification. That part's clear. It says, this is a statute of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, speak to the sons of Israel that they will bring you an unblemished red heifer in which there is no defect and on which the yoke has never been placed. And you shall give Eleazar the priest, and it shall be brought outside the camp and be slaughtered in his presence. That idea of a red heifer, usually, as I understand it, heifers usually have a white streak, at least on their face and usually between their legs. Yeah. This is a red heifer that doesn't have any white on it. So there's a specific reason for this heifer to be there, but it's for purification, I'm sure. So it's interesting. Not much is given, but tells us about what's supposed to happen. So the death of Miriam in chapter 21. Remember, she's Abraham's. No, I'm sorry, Aaron. Moses's sister. Yeah. And so this is going to be a major turning point, because Aaron is going to die later. But these are two major times in Israel's history. These are people that have been the leading of God's people for quite a while. And even though Miriam is only really just connected with Moses, it's still a real strong connection. Yeah. So, and then the rock at Merib. This is when Moses strikes the rock. Actually, the question is, what's going on? Let me make sure you understand this. We'll start at verse 2. There was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. The people were contended with Moses and saying, if only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. And then Numbers 20, verses 7 and 8. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it will yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation there be drink. Now, the drink in the water, that was necessary, right? I mean, he doesn't want them to thirst to death, so God's going to provide for it. The problem in verse 10, now listen, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and the water came forth abundantly, and the congregation there beast drank. Now, the congregation had no idea, as far as I can tell, that Moses had disobeyed. Right. But right after this, Moses gets chastened by God and said, because of this, you're not going into the land. Wow. Yeah, so this is actually really interesting. But I wondered, why is this so important? He actually tells them to take your rod. So he gives,
Yeah.
he could have easily said, go to the rock and don't take your rod and speak to it. There's
Yeah.
no way he would have hit it.
Don't you dare touch it or
Yeah,
something. Yeah.
but it looks like to me, verse 10 actually helps us see his attitude. Listen now, you
Right.
rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? So that actually suggests it's him doing it and not God,
Yeah.
and almost maybe taking credit for it instead of God doing it.
Yeah.
And it could be he's just so angry at these people that
Right.
he's frustrated and it takes it out on him.
Yeah.
But even that, when God tells you to do something and you do it wrong, he's going to hold them accountable.
Yeah.
So this is quite a moment. When we get to Deuteronomy, I want to show you that Moses, he goes back to this about 3 times and says, it was you guys that made it so that I couldn't go back into the promised land. So he blames it on them, even though he was the one that hit
Yeah.
it. Oh, I was trying to think, why would God do something? Why
Yeah.
this idea of just striking it once and then not striking it this time? Because that's what he had done before.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that it's very possible that God was going to use that as an image. Remember the striking the rock and then the cleansing or water comes out
Yeah.
to meet their needs. Well, I'm wondering if he was going to use that as a picture of Christ in the New Testament, where Christ is going to be struck, and then because of that, he's going to meet your needs.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that could have been an image, and now he can't use it because now this being struck a second time blows the image.
Interesting.
So I wonder. I don't remember. I don't know that's true. It just seems like that
it's
would be a very
fascinating idea. Yeah.
logical reason why that happened.
Yeah.
And it makes sense in the context, I think.
Right.
So,
That's interesting.
yeah. All right. Moses and Aaron cannot go into the promised land. So right after that, but the Lord said to Moses, so even though the people didn't know it, Moses knew, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel. Well, how would that treat him as not holy? And I guess the reason is because when I tell you something, you listen.
Yeah, you
and
gotta
if you
do it.
don't, that's not treating me as I deserve to be treated.
Yeah.
So this act of disobedience has serious consequences.
Yeah. Very serious.
Yeah. So it's interesting. All right. Then death of Aaron in chapter 20. He dies at Mount Horeb.
And this is into our third section, really.
Yes.
Right? This is the last kind of
Yep, sorry
big
about that.
section.
Okay, so Mount Horeb, you can see actually where they think that is.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, and Eleazar's son becomes priest. All right.
Yep.
Aaron, verse 24 says, and Aaron will be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the sons of Israel. So it's not, Aaron didn't even do anything. He was just with Moses
Yeah.
when he did it. But because of that, apparently,
shares it.
shares
Yeah.
the responsibility.
Wow.
Yeah. And he says, because of my command at the waters of Meribah. So he links it to that.
He knows, yeah.
All right. And then they have a victory over Arad. I wanted to show you. Now, Kadesh Barnea is at the very bottom of our map here. Arad is up there. Now, Arad, they didn't even have to come down against the Israelites because at this point, God had said, you're not going in. So the people of Arad could just have stayed there. But my guess is they don't know that. And so they go down and attack Israel, and they actually get destroyed for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I just thought it was interesting. They didn't need to go down, but
Yeah.
but they didn't probably know that. Chapter 21, they grumble again, and God sent serpents and many people die. Verse 4 and 5. Now they sent out from Mount Horeb by the way of the Red Sea and go around the land of Edom. Because remember, he told them they couldn't go through Edom.
Yeah.
And the people came impatient because of the journey. And the people spoke against God and Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt in the wilderness? So now remember, they're heading down to the Red Sea and then going to go up because they're going around the Moabite place. So it's actually kind of interesting to see that. Or I'm sorry, I said Moab. I meant the land of Edom. So they were going out.
Oh.
That's where Edom was down there.
Yeah,
and they're
yeah.
going on the other side. All right. And he sends these fiery serpents on them. He then says to make a fiery serpent and put it on a standard, and it shall come about that everyone who's bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. That was a real interesting thing.
Yeah.
It seems like to me the very thing that's causing the issue is now, I assume, on a stake, and I assume that stake is the idea that he's dead. He's been lifted, it's been lifted up, and he's sticking on this stake. So I assume he's dead.
Yeah.
And I assume that's what it's the idea of somebody because remember, New Testament picks this up, and the idea of he's unless I be lifted up, I will draw. I won't draw him every man, but I will if I'm lifted up.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that it's at least probably taken up this image of when they looked at that standard with the bronze or whatever the snake is that's there. They're gonna be healed.
Yeah.
My guess is that in their minds, they're obeying God, and God's, in the very context is, if they got bit, they look, and because of that act of obedience, they're healed.
Yeah.
But I also think that that's then picked up in New Testament for that same logical reason,
Right.
that when you look at that thing because you've been told to do it, you're healed. And I
Yeah.
assume that's the logic. So it's interesting again. It's using these images to help provide something that later on will provide an image for them.
Further meaning or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right. Victory over Sihon and Og. They're coming up on this side of the Dead Sea.
Kind of the east side.
Yeah. And so we've got Damascus, or actually Damascus is over even above this. That's kind of in the wrong spot. But they've got the Sihon and Og in those two areas there. Those are the very first two people that get their armies come against the Israelites and they get punished.
Yeah.
So here it says, God sent messengers to Sihon the Amorite, saying, "Let me pass through your land. We will not turn off to the field or vineyard. We will not drink water from your wells. We will go by the king's highway until we have passed through your border." See, he's letting them know we're not coming as a threat.
Yeah.
We're not coming to steal your stuff. We're
not
just
to
coming.
stay either, really.
Yeah,
We're
we're
just
just
going
coming
through.
to move. But Sihon would not permit Israel to pass through the border. So Sihon gathered his people, went out against Israel in the wilderness, and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. Then in Numbers 33, they went and turned and went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, went out. So now we've got the two kings. I wanted to have a passage that showed that they fought both of those people and wiped them out.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, and then Balaam and Balak. Remember?
Oh, yeah.
Balak's the king. He's up
Yeah.
on this side of we're not exactly sure where he is, but somewhere on the Dead Sea side. He doesn't want the Israelites to come through, so he calls on Balak to curse them. Now, Balaam to curse them. Balaam is a pagan king or a pagan prophet.
Yeah.
And he must have been famous enough that this guy could call on him and do that. So so at first God tells him not to go. So God says, I can't go, so I can't do it. Then God tells him he can go. All right. Now, verse 20, chapter 22, verse 20 and 21. So God came to Balaam at night and said to him, "If the men who have come to you call you and to rise up and go with them, but only the word which I say to you, you shall speak." So Balaam rose in the morning and saddled his donkey and went with the leaders of Moab. Okay, now, verse 22. But God was angry because he was going, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way and as an adversary against him. Now he's riding on his donkey, and the two servants were with him. Okay, I think I got one more verse here. And the donkeys, So here okay, well, I'll go on and say, then the donkey saw the angel of the Lord. She sat down under Balaam. So Balaam was angry and struck the donkey with a stick. And the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey and said to Balaam, what have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times? And Balaam said to the donkey, because you've made a mockery of me. I hear he's talking to a donkey and he doesn't seem to get a connection there. But if I had my sword if I'd had my sword in my hand, I would have killed you by now. And the donkey said to Balaam, am I not your donkey on which you have ridden all your life to this day? Have I ever accustomed to do this to you? And he said, no. So the donkey is more logical than Balaam.
Yeah.
So here there's the angel of the Lord tries to kill him, and the donkey speaks to him. The purpose seems to be in verse 32, where it says, let's see if I've got it here. Yeah, the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his sword drawn in his hand, and he bowed all the way to the ground. And the angel of the Lord said to him, why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out as an adversary, because your way was contrary to me. That's the translation. I think it maybe your way was thrown down against me. The wording is kind of hard, or could be your way was reckless before me. So I think what's going on is that Balaam was going but he hadn't really guarded his. He wasn't really convinced that he needed to guard his words real close. After this, there is no way Balaam is going to say anything but what he's supposed to say. So I actually think this is a illustration to make sure that Balaam really stuck to what God told him.
He does what's supposed to.
Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting passage, but it seems so odd at first because God tells him to go. And then when he goes, God's angry at him. So the logic is, I think he's trying to train Balaam. You say only what I tell you, and now I'll bet he will.
Yeah, right.
Minute he saw that angel of the Lord, I think he probably thought that.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. It's funny. Balaam is supposed to curse him, and he keeps blessing him. I think the logic, notice he remembers he keeps moving to same spots or different spots. I wonder if he thinks it's a local god, and if he gets out of the area where this god covers, that he can then curse him. So at least that's what I think is going on. Some have questioned that, but I actually think that's probably the logic.
Yeah.
In verse 24:17, it says that a star from Israel will come and destroy Edom. I think that's probably David, because David, we know, later does that. Here, I read it for you. See him now, and behold him, not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, a scepter shall rise from Israel, and shall crush through the forehead of Moab, and tear down all the sons of Sheth. See, my understanding is that that's David, because in for 2 Samuel 8:2, it actually talks about his defeat of Moab and him killing quite a few of them. And then Samuel says he did it again. But I wonder if it could also go further and also cover the Messiah, because we do know it says in that day they will sweep down on the slopes of Philistine. That's in chapter 11:14.
Yeah.
Together they will plunder the sons of the east. They will possess Edom and Moab, and the sons of Ammon will be subject to them.
Yeah.
So maybe it does have a further connection that initially David fulfills it just fine, but it also has an image of what the Messiah will also do in that messianic age, future age.
Yeah.
So I think it's possible to open it up even further. Oh, the sin of Peor. This one's interesting because you learn something here that you didn't know before. At Shittim, the Moabites invite the Israelites to a feast for their God. God was furious because really they knew that they weren't supposed to do that kind of thing.
Right.
One blatant sinner went into his tent with a Moabite woman in front of Moses and Phineas. And Phineas, I don't know if you remember, but he takes a spear and stabs it through both of them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's at that God blesses him and says that his family will be a priest forever. And at that point, God stops the plague. Yeah. So it says that there were about 24,000 people who died in 25:9. It's interesting. Numbers actually 31 actually tells us that it's we didn't know this before, but it says, and Moses said to them, have you spared the women? Behold, these caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam.
Oh.
So you would have never known that had it not been for this next verse, chapters later.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So apparently Balaam knew that he couldn't curse the Israelites, but if he could get the Israelites to sin, their own God would curse them. Yeah. So we look at Balaam as being this prophet for God. Well, he's not. He's a pagan. And he even gives them the way to get the Israelites, even though he can't do it on his own.
Yeah.
So I thought that's interesting.
Yeah, that is.
And then we've got Israel being numbered again in chapter 6. Yeah, sorry about that. This time, remember, they were afraid to go into the land because they thought that the Canaanites were too strong for them. Now God's going to make them go in. Notice that now they're going to have even less.
Yeah.
So another 2,000 less people, soldiers, and they're still going to have to go in.
Yeah.
My guess is that God was teaching them a lesson. It's not how many people you have, it's whether you obey God or not.
Yeah, sure.
So I think that's what's going on. You've got the daughters of Zelophehad in chapter 27. Zelophehad dies, and he's only got daughters, so he's got no way to pass on his land to his relatives because he doesn't have any sons.
Yeah.
And it says, they ask God, well, what do we do? And God tells them, go ahead and pass it on to the daughters because they didn't want a family in Israel to not have a part of land. So it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to come back to that later, okay? All right, then in later in that, we've got Joshua succeeding Moses, okay? In verse 14, it says, in the wilderness Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to treat me as holy before their eyes at the water. So he makes it real clear. That's why he's not going in. All right. And then the purpose, again, was he did not treat him holy.
Yeah.
So, Joshua will take over after him, and he's commissioned in front of the people to make sure they know. Then we've got these laws and offerings and vows. They're kind of interesting. There was the different offerings that were to be offered on the different times of the year, and then vows were to be kept, but they could be annulled. What was interesting, it talks about it that if a wife makes a vow and her husband didn't know it, and he comes back and he finds out that she made it, he can annul that. Yeah, and again, the logic is the wife was under the husband's authority. She could not make vows.
Oh, sure.
That the husband, and it talked about husbands or fathers for children and stuff like that. So there were logic ways that they could be annulled.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then chapter 31 talks about war with the Midianites. And basically, it goes back to Balaam
Again.
Yeah.
Wow.
So at Baal Peor, they totally slaughtered them because of this.
Wow.
They killed even the women, except for those girls who had not known a man. Not a soldier died from Israel. That was interesting, making sure you knew this was God's doing this. Oh, okay. Transjordan tribes then get their land. They actually tell Moses that they want this land that Sihon and Og had, and Moses okays it. But he says the only way you'll do it, I'll do this, is if you help us conquer the land on the other side of the Jordan.
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense. They agree. All right. Then in chapter 33, you've got the itinerary of the wilderness wanderings. It's really interesting. It makes it real clear how far they got. And then people have talked about this. There in the ancient Near East, there were what are called these travel lists, and they're very similar to what you've got here. God makes it real clear, though, they're supposed to destroy all the inhabitants. God did not want Baalism to come back, and he said, and basically the only way you could do that is to wipe it all out.
Yeah.
So then Transjordan allotments, now those 2.5 tribes get their land. The Levitical cities, there's 42 of them, spread out all over the land. Actually, I think that one actually says there's 42. I think there's 48 of them in the next one. So we'll talk about that later. Maybe it's a different time period. I'll show you it. Cities of refuge, they were always 6. And that was so that anyone who accidentally killed somebody. We're going to come back to these because you'll see these again, and I'll show you where they are and stuff like that. Then here's that, chapter 36, we got the Zelophehad daughters again.
Yeah.
This time now, it says, now if these women marry somebody outside the tribe, they're not supposed to transfer the land to another tribe.
Okay.
Now, here's what I want to know. Why didn't God just say at the time when they came for the Zelophehad the first time, they didn't say, yeah, you can do it among the daughters, but if those daughters may, and I think the reason is God only tells us stuff that we want to know at certain points in the time. So this demanded that they had to come back and keep a relationship with God going.
Yeah.
So I think that's the logic of not telling them more than what they asked for at that point.
Yeah.
Even though God knew it was going to happen and he knew they were going to have to come back, I think the logic was, you stick with me and I'll
give you the next step.
Yeah, have this relationship so that we're continuing to talk.
Yeah.
So I thought that's interesting. All right. What do we learn about God in this passage?
A lot. There's still patience,
Okay.
but also a high standard,
Yeah.
and
yeah.
you have to meet that, or there's consequences.
Yeah, and you obey. I think the thing we learned from Moses, especially and Aaron,
Yeah.
you obey me or you suffer the consequences. Yeah. What's the purpose for the Balaam story?
It's really interesting, actually. I mean, it seems like it's just straightening exactly what he says up for that period of time.
Okay.
Like, he has to kind of be obedient
Yeah.
because he kind of understands the threat that he's under.
Yeah. And I think it's also helped Balak know, you better not mess with these people. These people are God's chosen people. And every time he gets mad
That's
at Balaam
true.
because
Yeah.
instead of cursing me, he's blessing him.
Yeah.
And he's saying, listen,
I have
these
a
are my
choice.
people.
Yeah.
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 All right. What's the importance why is it important that there are two censi, I guess, in the book?
Well, I think it kind of shows you where they were and where they end up, basically, right?
Okay. And isn't it also I think I mentioned this, that they go in the second time and they have to have fewer people.
Yeah,
So
right.
the logic is they're going to have even more faith to go in the second time. So I think that's part of it too.
Yeah.
Why does God let Moses see the promised land? Isn't that, God is gracious, isn't he?
Yeah.
He didn't have to do that,
That's
did
true.
he?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
now Moses knows they're actually going to get that land and they can actually see the land.
That's true.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think that's really gracious.
Yeah.
What's the importance of the way Joshua was commissioned? We didn't really cover that, but it was a very clear passing over of the from one leader to the next leader, and God was very clear. It was front of the people and very openly clear. They knew who they were supposed to follow.
Yeah, which that happens in a lot of other times in the Old Testament. There's some kind of, maybe not always miraculous, but there's something very public that kind of shows that passing of authority in the leaders of Israel.
Yeah. Was Balaam a pagan prophet or one of God's prophets?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. Yeah.
I think we now know he was pagan.
He was.
And he was clear, even though God can use a pagan.
Yeah, that's what's kind of interesting about it, is he still had to obey God.
Yeah.
You know?
There's still people in Egypt, right? Remember the magicians? They at one point, they could copy things, but then at one point they say, man, we can't do this. You better fear that God.
Yeah.
So God's actually using that pagan person to help the other people know more about this God.
Yeah.
Which again, I think that is very
Yeah.
kind, very gracious of God.
Yeah.
So, all right, here's our conclusions. God chose to make Israel his people to be a light to the rest of the nations. And we talked about that, a priest, they're going to be a priest, a nation of priests to them.
Yeah.
God gives the stipulations of how the nation should respond and be a good example of their God, even though they rarely did it, right? The tabernacle was the presence it was a representation of the presence of God for the Israelites. And using that to teach them when to get up, when to go, stuff like that, I thought was very important.
Yeah.
And then we got two more. Sacrifices helped them to learn that sin had consequences and a price had to be paid, so that became important.
Yep.
And then the Israelites broke God's covenant, but it could be repaired, and that's, I think, real crucial. So now that means that all those people are going to die who rebelled against God, but the next generation he's going to carry on with, right? So I actually think that's really important too. They can break the relationship, but it can also be healed.
Restoration's possible.
Yeah. So I thought that's numbers.
Yeah,
and I thought you were worried that this didn't have some really good stuff in it.
Well, you know, that's been my struggle. Numbers is where I get stuck if I'm doing a yearly Bible reading plan. This happened to me last year. It's a little tricky. It's not as I guess it's less familiar to me than like Genesis or Exodus. You know,
I hoped what I did provided some of the logic, because some of the things that they do seem so illogical. But after you hear why they're doing it and the logic, I think it then makes sense.
Yeah, it brings a lot of clarity to it.
Yeah, so I hope that helped.
I agree. I think that's very helpful.
Well, we'll get ready for the next one.
That's right. Yeah, next one's Deuteronomy. Yeah.
Okay, yep.
All right. Very good.
See ya.
Yeah.